Okay, welcome back to this second part of the workshop. We move from the history of Lippmann photography to holography, its application, and virtual reality. And for the first talk, we have Massimo Locatelli, Massimiliano Locatelli, scusa. He's a researcher at National Institute of Optics. He works mainly in the field of digital holography and in particular in infrared digital holography and its application for remote monitoring. The title of his talk is Infrared Digital Holography for Remote Monitoring. Please, Massimiliano.
Thank you, Thomas. Hello, everybody. I will present our research activity in the field of infrared digital holography at the National Institute of Optics of Florence. I will start with a brief description of the basic principles of digital holography. Then I will discuss the advantages offered by infrared radiation in digital holography. And finally, I will show you two applications developed in our laboratories, that is vision through smoke and flames and remote monitoring of large structures. So let's see what is digital holography. Digital holography is nothing else the natural development of analog holography, ideated by Gabor in the 40s. And so it's a faraway relative of Lippmann photography. Its working principles are quite simple. I'm going to illustrate you a little bit. We have a laser beam which is split into two beams. A first beam called the object beam is sent toward an object to be investigated. The second beam, called the reference beam, is sent toward an appropriate digital recording device. The radiation scattered back from the sample then interferes with the reference beam and creates an interferometric pattern, which is the hologram. And then we can insert this digital hologram matrix inside the discrete form of the Rayleigh-Sommerfeld integral in order to calculate numerically the complex wavefront coming from the sample. Starting from this complex wavefront, it is then possible to reconstruct an amplitude image of the sample, which is a sort of black and white image, and a phase image of the sample, which contains information about the optical path of the object beam, and therefore, ultimately, it contains information about any deformation or displacement of the sample surface. Usually, digital holography is realized using visible radiation. However, it has been realized also in other range of the electromagnetic spectrum. Our group was the first in 2003 to move to longer wavelength in the infrared range using CO2 lasers and pyroelectric camera or thermal cameras. Working at a longer wavelength has two advantages: a lower vibration sensitivity and a larger field of view. These two advantages, combined with the high output power of CO2 laser and their high coherence length, make it possible to record quite easily video holograms of large dynamic scenes from remote distance, even working out of controlled laboratory conditions. Here are the main ingredients to realize infrared digital holography. You need an infrared laser source. You need an appropriate infrared detector, which is used without its objective. It's just the naked sensor. And appropriate optics, lenses, mirrors, polarizers, and so on. Currently, we are using an air-cooled CO2 laser at 10.6 micrometers with a 40 watt output power and a micropolometric camera with a full HD resolution, 15 microns of pixel pitch and 50 hertz of frame rate. All these stuffs are inserted in a relatively compact prototype, which can be mounted on a tripod. And here are some examples of amplitude reconstructions obtained starting from infrared digital holograms. You can see very large human-sized samples like this mannequin, or even moving samples like this rotating small Perseo statue. And you can, and we have also a human being hologram, which can be easily recorded despite the unavoidable micro movements of a living body. And this is a much more complex task using visible radiation. So let's see the first application, that is vision through smoke and flames. As you can imagine, this application has relevant potential in the field of fire rescue, of fire emergency, to let rescuers move safely in a fire scenario and to help them in identifying people or things hidden behind a curtain of smoke and flames. As you know, unfortunately, standard imaging systems cannot see through smoke and flames. Indeed, for example, visible imaging systems cannot see neither through smoke nor through flames, while thermal cameras can see through smoke, and indeed are used for this purpose by firefighters. But unfortunately, thermal cameras are blinded by flames, as you can see in the last image. On the contrary, infrared digital holography is able to see both through smoke and through flames. Let's see in detail how such a result is obtained. To demonstrate visibility through smoke, we inserted the sample inside the plexiglass box and filled it with smoke. And as you can see here in this video, while the sample disappears in the smoke, its holographic image remain clearly visible. However, as I just told, this result is due mainly to the well-known capacity of infrared radiation to penetrate through smoke, and indeed, actually, a similar result can be obtained also using a simple thermal camera with this objective. Instead, vision through flame is a peculiar property of digital holography. As you can see here, where candle and oven flames are disturb the visible images and the thermal images, but are not present, the flame image is not present in the holographic images. Here, for example, you can see a video, a thermographic video, and in comparison with a holographic video, now it's starting, it's going to start, of a human being hidden by flames. And as you can see, in the holographic video, it's still possible to identify the human body. There are two main reasons behind this result. First of all, the flame radiation is not coherent with the laser radiation, and therefore it does not contribute at all to the interferometric pattern, which is the element containing the whole information about the sample. And the second reason is that holography is a lensless technique, and so there is no lens to focus the image of the sample and also the image of the flame on the detector, and so in such a way you avoid any saturation effect of the detector. This imaging system is patent protected, and we are still working on it in order to improve it in view of its possible application as a fixed location, or maybe mounted on a robot, or even better integrated in the firefighters' equipment. To this purpose, we are working on the miniaturization of the system with encouraging results. To reach such a goal, we decided to change wavelength. We moved toward the short wave infrared range at 1.5 micrometers because these wavelengths offer some advantages. First of all, these wavelengths, which are commonly used in communications, are considered relatively high safe. And secondly, in this range, compact and robust fiber-coupled lasers are available, and this means that you can separate the laser source from the optical system, interferometric system, so that you can imagine to carry on the laser source in a backpack and to miniaturize the optical system and integrate it in the equipment, for example, in the helmet of firefighters, or even hand carrying it. And indeed, here you can see a video. Just the last advantage is the high sensitivity of the in-gas detectors. This is important, crucial parameter, because you can use lower laser power, and furthermore you can reduce the exposure time down to few tens of microseconds in order to freeze the fringes. And this is what make it possible to handheld the system, despite it is a very sensitive to radiation interferometric system. Here you can see, for example, a video that we have realized using our current prototype of the digital holography, and it was realized handhelding the system. And now I will show you the second application. While for the previous application we were interested in the amplitude image obtained from the holograms, for this application we need to use the phase image, because we want to measure the displacement of very large surfaces. In particular, we demonstrated the possibility to measure from remote distance with submicrometric resolution the displacements of large size structures like buildings, bridges, and so on. In particular, it is possible to measure the amplitude and frequencies of the natural oscillation modes of these structures, and these are crucial parameters to measure the seismic vulnerability of the structure and this state of conservation. Furthermore, thanks to the non-invasiveness of this technique, it becomes possible to think of systematic measurement, investigation of entire urban areas, a thing that is not possible with current measurement technique based on seismometers. I will show you an example of a measurement obtained during a measurement campaign on a historical structure in Tuscany, the Rocca della Dicofani. In this occasion, we compared our holographic measurements with the seismometric measurements, obtained positioning two seismometers at the top of the tower. Instead, we, with our system, holographic system, we looked at the upper part of the tower, of the main tower of the structure. And as you can see from these graphs, there was a very good agreement between holographic and seismometric data, both for what regards the displacements of the structure and for what regards the spectrum of the frequencies. Here you can see in detail that when the displacement of the structure is below 0.1 over 0.1 micrometers, the agreement between holographic and seismometric data are really, really good. Also, this system is patent protected, and I want to underline that it's a very flexible technique which could have other important applications, for example, in the field of cultural heritage, for the monitoring of statues, frescoes, and so on, and also in the field of earth sciences, for example, for the investigation of rocky fronts or for trees monitoring. Just for this last application, I want to show you some preliminary results obtained at Arcetri. Here you can see that we are looking at 3 different trees located at different distances, and we can, using infrared digital holography, we can obtain a global phase map of the scene and so we can analyze the relative movements of these trees, and these are important parameter to understand their health state. Thanks you to everybody.
Thank you, Massimiliano. Are there, Massimo, questions? Yeah.
Thank you, Massimiliano. What's the main problem to use it with fog? So if you want to see through fog.
Using CO2 laser at 10.6
No, you can change frequency, of course.
No, yes, it
could work.
Probably in this region, maybe it should work better through fog.
Because I mean, it looks like an important problem for
Yes,
for
of course,
for cars and things like this. So
the truth, no. The problem is the same. You have to identify the
But if
right
you have
wavelength.
a wavelength that is not absorbed by water or whatever, and then it's large enough not to be scattered too much, it works.
You can use it, of course.
Right.
Thank you.
Other questions? No? Okay, so thanks again, Massimiliano. We now have Niccolò accanto. Niccolò is a physicist and researcher at Institut de la Vision in Paris. His research focuses on holographic shaping of laser beams for the stimulation of neurons. So wait a moment, we have to set... Okay, Niccolò accanto, combining digital holography with optogenetics for the study of the brain. Please.
Okay. Yeah, I think this is working. Yeah, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Yeah, I would like to first of all thank especially Massimo for the invitation. And then I'll probably go for a... This is okay? I can see it if it's okay. All right. So my talk is gonna be about biology. So I hope you like it a bit. So I'll try to give another application of holography besides the one that you've just seen. Of digital holography, and in particular, I'm gonna apply it to the study of the brain, which is what we do in Paris in the group of Valentina Emiliani. So before starting with the physics, then I'll go back, well, I'll go to biology. And it's funny that also Massimo showed some images from Ramon and Cajal, which is the kind of the father of modern neuroscience, and who drew all these pictures that I'm going to show in this slide. So basically, this is a neuron, right? So this is the building block of the brain. Neurons have this like a beautiful shape. They have this body and all these dendrites and an axon that neurons use to make contact and transmit information to the others. So neuronal information is basically those kind of signals that you see there. So it's basically electrical signals. And the way neurons make contact with the others, well, is by, sending axons and dendrites. And the picture becomes very complex very soon. And to give you an idea of what is going on in the human brain, we have something like 10 to the 11 neurons that form something like 10 to the 16 connections. And the relevant time scale, as you can see there, for basically neuronal information to propagate is the millisecond. So of course you can see that this problem has a very complex solution. Actually, it has no experimental solution today. But maybe this is not necessary if we want to understand how neurons transmit information and compute brain information. Maybe we can basically restrict ourselves to a smaller region of the brain, maybe a portion of the cortex, for example. And we want to try now and understand how each neuron basically transmits information to compute what we actually call perception, to guide our behavior, and to make us who we are. And this was what people proposed already in this famous paper of 2012, in which researchers actually proposed to optically record and manipulate the activity of every neuron in a circuit. And they believed that was possible in 2012. And the good news is that it is actually possible. And this was the paper that actually started one of the largest research project in human history, which was the Brain Initiative that started in America, in the States, and produced a lot of the results that I'm gonna show you some of those today. So the solution is optics, and basically likely for this workshop, the solution that we actually apply to this problem is holography in its digital form, and in a bit of a different way from what you've seen in the previous talk. So I'll try to explain you how this works, but before, a little bit more of biology, because I would like to explain you why optics is important at all to study the brain. And there's actually two reasons. The first reason is that we can today read out neuronal activity from neurons by using light. So neuronal activity, as I said, is basically electrical signals. But today, people develop these beautiful proteins that are called calcium or voltage indicators that can be expressed in neurons. And what they do is that they convert electrical signals into fluorescent emission. So now if we put a neuronal network under, for example, in this case, a two-photon microscope, then you can see that we can actually pick up the neuronal activity from individual neurons, and we can actually infer back the neuronal signal, the electrical signals, by looking at variation of fluorescence that is coming out of the neurons. So we can read out neuronal activity with light, but this is not sufficient if we want to understand how a neuronal circuit works. And the other ingredient is that we need to be able to manipulate or induce neuronal activity by using light, which is basically the broad field of optogenetics. So now you use a different proteins, which is not the indicators that I've showed you before. It's called an opsin. You still, by genetically means, you basically encode it into neurons. And now if you shine light onto them, you can basically, at will, activate them, so induce neuronal activity, induce electrical signals. So now we have a two-way mechanism that we can interact with the brain. We can read out neuronal activity with light, and we can induce it with light. Now, back to physics, the question is, what is the best way that we can optically photostimulate neurons? So this process of inducing light, of inducing activity with light is called photostimulation. So what's the best optical strategy to do that? Now, the simplest way is just to shine light everywhere. So you basically express these opsins in the brain, and then you use wide field excitation, blue light typically, and you can see that you basically can activate all the neurons at the same time. And this is very good if you want to understand how a certain brain regions, for example, generates or influences behavior. However, this is clearly not the way to go if we want to reproduce or interact or interfere with this activity. We want to be actually very precise on individual neurons, probably on groups of neurons, but we definitely do not want to excite everything at the same time, because this is not what the brain does. So if we want to do what the brain does, we need a method that can allow us to be very precise on individual groups of neurons, and then reconfigure this excitation in order to excite at different moment another group of neurons. So the solution exists, and it's actually holography. So I'll spend the next couple of minutes explaining you how we can achieve this by using a digital version of holography. So differently from the previous talk, I'm going to use holography to spatially shape a laser beam. So if we make the connection with the Gabor's original form of holography, again, we have a laser beam, we have an object that we want to basically capture its properties, and we divide the laser beam into arms, the object arm that is reflected off the object, and the reference beam that propagates unaltered, and we record on a photographic film basically the interference between these two different beams. And this is the hologram. So now, in the previous version of, in the previous talk, basically you've seen that if you, you can basically replace this photographic film by a camera or a digital recorder, and you can record a digital hologram. Now, the kind of digital holography that I'm talking about is actually not this one. I'm gonna have to act on the second step of original holography, which is the reconstruction of the object. So in the original version of holography, once you have the hologram, you basically don't do anything with it if you don't reconstruct it, again, using the laser beam. So you now get rid of the object arm, you only have the reference arm, and the interaction or the diffraction between this reference beam and the hologram itself basically reproduces the original objects. Or you can see it in these terms, the hologram like forces the laser beam to reproduce the original object. So now we have a way that we can basically teach our laser to behave as we want. If we replace the analog hologram by a digital hologram. So imagine we have a machine, a digital machine that basically can at will reproduce the hologram that we want, in order that the laser beam now is diffracted to create the object that we want at the sample plane of our microscope, for example. Now, this machine actually exists. It's called a spatial light modulator. This is basically a screen composed of liquid crystal pixels. And what we now can do is that, since we know the laws of propagation of light, which is basically the Maxwell's equations, we can now calculate with the computer the hologram, the phase hologram that we wanted to apply on our spatial light modulator in order to have to reproduce the scene that we want in our microscope. And this is the way it experimentally works. This is an experiment that we did in our group. So we have the spatial light modulator. You see a computer interface that we developed. So now there basically we draw the object that we want to reproduce, and then the computer calculates back the phase that we need to apply to the hologram in order to force our laser to reproduce this object. So now in this bottom part, you basically see the fluorescence from a fluorescence light on which we focused our laser beam. And you can see that in real time, we can basically calculate and update the hologram onto the spatial light modulator, and we can recreate the object that we want. And now, well, going back to neurons, then this is the method that we're going to use to excite the neurons that we want in the precise way we want in order to reproduce the neuronal activity. So starting from this concept, I'm gonna spend the next 10 minutes, I think I still have probably, to tell you a couple of concepts more about our methods that we develop in Paris. So the first one is gonna be a method to be even more precise than this on the neurons that we want, that is gonna use nonlinear excitations and not only spatial, but also temporal beam shaping. And then I will touch on the last application that we've developed in recent years, which is basically the way to go if we want to miniaturize all this and put all this on the tip of an optical fiber so that we can do different kind of studies. Okay, so back to this spatial shaping that I was talking about. So you have this spatial light modulator, and we want typically to reproduce the shape of a neuron. So this is on the right side here, you have a real experiment in which we actually shaped our laser to reproduce the neuron. However, in linear optics, there is a problem if you do this. And the problem is that basically if you, the bigger the lateral extent of the shape that you want to make, then the lower the axial resolution, the lower the axial confinement. So basically, if you start off with a very small diffraction limited spot at the sample plane, and you now go to a something which has the size of a neuron, which is 10 to 20 microns, then you basically lose axial resolution. And that means that you have if you have a three-dimensional object, which is like a brain, and you have many different neurons at different planes, then you just risk to excite all of them at the same time, which goes back to the original problem that this way we're basically going to activate most of the neurons, and this is not what we want to do. So in order to get rid of this, well, you cannot get rid of this with linear optics. What you can do is go to nonlinear optics and introduce what I called in the previous slide, this temporal shaping. So, or this temporal focusing technique. So now we go to the nonlinear regime. So we need a infrared laser and a pulsed laser. And what we're gonna do is that we're gonna temporally shape it at the same time that we spatially shape it with holography in such a way that our laser beam basically gets stretched in time after this temporal focusing actuator, but in such a way that the laser pulse becomes shorter and shorter again after the microscope objective until it gets to the shortest possible time duration at the sample plane, and then it gets longer and longer again. So if you do this and you're using nonlinear optics, then what you're basically doing is that you're lowering the excitation probability outside of the sample plane, and you're keeping high enough excitation probability only at the sample plane. So experimentally, this is done by using a diffraction grating that disperses the components of light, which corresponds to a longer pulse, basically, until all these components are back together at the sample plane, which remains the only plane at which your two-photon excitation probability is sufficient to photostimulate a neuron. So I'll show you in a bit the results of this technique. But basically now we want to do holography in its digital form that I call in this slide computer-generated holography. So this CGH is for computer-generated holography. So we need to couple this with this other technique. And the way to do that is that, well, basically you put your spatial light modulator before the diffraction grating, and now you focus the shape that you want. It will be neurons at the diffraction grating plane, and this will keep a good X resolution, and hopefully it will allow us to still basically be very precise on the individual neurons that we want to excite. Okay, so I'll jump a few years now, and I'll go to the last implementation of this idea that we developed a few years back that actually uses two different steps for computer-generated holography. So we use two different spatial light modulators. The first one is the one that is going to create the shape that we want. For example, the neurons that we shapes that resemble the neuron. Then we have the diffraction grating for the temporal focusing. And then we're going to have a second spatial light modulator that is going to basically displace all the shape that we want in the 3 dimensions in order to excite all the neurons that we want. So the largest possible group of neurons will the best possible resolution. So this is an experiment that we did. So this is the reconstruction of a volume in which we asked our spatial light modulators to focus our 2-photon excitations on 50 different spots, which is going to simulate 50 different neurons. And you can see that we can do this. However, these spots are not very well defined. And this is because it's the temporal focusing, so the temporal shaping was not into the game yet. And this is what happens when you put the temporal focusing in it. So you can see that the X resolution becomes much better. And now we can really create excitation spot in the volume that we want that have, well, not exactly, but that they go really close to the size of a neuron. So it's going to be something which has 10 microns in all the axis, and it allows us to be really precise on the neurons that we want. So this is an example of using this technique in an actual experiment. So on the top left part, you see in green an image of neurons. And this is in a very compact and close-packed sample. So you see that all these neurons are very close together. So it's very hard optically to go and precisely target individual neurons out of this ensemble. But if you do this technique, then this is what you can get. So you can see that we are basically able to target only the neurons that we want with this red beam that is our infrared laser, and this is going to stimulate only the neurons that we want and not the neurons around. So with this, I'm done with the first application, basically, which is, again, combining both spatial shaping with computer-generated holography and temporal shaping to be very precise on the neurons. And now, in the last application we developed, we basically asked ourselves the question if we can do this on a miniaturized way. So basically, if we can make a microscope very compact in such a way that it fits the tip of an optical fiber, and this can be important, for example, if we want to study animals, for example, mice that are free to move, or if you want to one day translate this technology with its limitation, of course, to an hospital in which it's very hard to have a two-photon microscope with many different spatial light modulators altogether. What you can do is that you have your optical setup somewhere, and then you just have a fiber that goes directly wherever you want. And so this was the motivation behind this work. Of course, we are not the only ones doing this. So you can see that in the last few years, there have been several publications on this. So we jumped into this subject. 1 minute, I'm almost done. So basically, we're using, again, a spatial light modulator, and now we're using an optical fiber, where actually what we call a fiber bundle. So it's a fiber that has many different fibers in it. So the diameter of this object is around 500 microns, and you have 20,000 cores, 20,000 individual fibers, very compact in it. And what you can do is that basically you can transmit the two-photon pattern illumination that I showed you before. And each one of these spots that you see in this bottom image can be used to photostimulate a neuron. And in the very last video, this is an actual experiment that we performed. So in this case, the fluorescence, I mean, we're really exciting with the two-photon excitation through the fiber. We're collecting the light through the fiber. We are detecting it after the fiber. And what you can see is that this is an image of neurons that are firing spontaneously. And on top of it, each time you see the zeros appearing, we're basically inducing photostimulation. So inducing artificially neuronal activity, and you can see that basically at each time we do this, basically you have a burst of light, of fluorescence from these neurons, and that corresponds to the fact that these neurons are photoactivated. And this is the traces that you can collect, and you can see that again, even after the fiber, we're very precise on the individual neurons that we want, and we have really low crosstalk excitation of other neurons. So with this, I hope I convinced you that holography is important for the study of the brain. I showed you the applications that we developed in our group. And I would like to thank all the members of the groups and collaborators, and of course yourselves, for the attention. Thank you.
So thank you, Niccolò. Are there questions? Massimo?
So you start with a number which is around 10 to the 11. Then you are down to 50. So what's the goal now?
So there's different goals. Yeah, of course, going to more neurons is one of the goals. Even though people have showed that even with lower than 50 neurons, you can already understand, you can already start understanding how neurons actually modify a network, modify perception, behavior. So it's a number that is close to the one that we need for the moment to understand how neurons work. Of course, the more the better. The downside is that the more means more light into the brain, and at some point you start having too much light into the brain, and the neurons do not like that. There's different ways you can target the problem, but basically what so the field is moving towards more neurons, larger fields of view, because that is a problem as well. Faster refreshing rate, because these SLMs typically have a 20 to 100 hertz refresh rate, and we want to go to kilohertz at least. So all these problems are open questions, and we're working on that. But yeah, one of the questions is getting to more neurons, yes. Okay. There's also a genetic part with it. I mean, you can also target it genetically by expressing more efficient compounds. So there's a lot of study on that as well.
Okay, if there are not other questions, Okay, for the next talk, we have Irene Petrizzo from the University of Florence. Irene research focuses on the relationship between action and perception in the theoretical framework of the atom theory. In particular, she has been investigating the possibility of a shared perceptual system dedicated to the perception of space, time, and numerosity, and its relation with the motor system. She will do a talk with the title Virtual Reality. Come preferisci? Se preferisci stare in piedi, questo.
Hello, everyone. And so I work at the Florence Visual Lab at the University of Florence. And today I'm going to talk about virtual reality as a tool for perception research and how I've been using it in my research to perform experiments that wouldn't have been feasible otherwise. I want to start with a brief introduction about what is virtual reality and how it works. And instead of talking about virtual reality, what we want to talk about is XR, or extended reality. Extended reality is an umbrella term that groups together all of the possible insertions in a real environment of virtual elements. The most straightforward definition that we can give of virtual reality is a simulation of an environment achieved through computer's graphics. So if we imagine a spectrum where we have reality as we perceive it on one end and pure virtual reality on the other end of the spectrum, so where every element that we perceive has been virtually generated, then things like augmented reality and augmented virtuality that you might have heard about are placed in the middle. And what changes is the proportion between real elements and virtual elements. And as we progress along the spectrum, the level of immersiveness of the environment increases. So how much the user is shut off from the real world. Let's give a few examples. So augmented reality is the example of an extended reality that is most widely spread nowadays. So a lot of you might have come in contact with things like Pokemon Go, which was an application that allowed you to go around and you open the front camera of the phone, and then virtual elements like Pokemons were inserted in the virtual environment. Even Snapchat filters or Instagram filters, even though we are not used to thinking about them as augmented reality, are an example of augmented reality, because there is the real element that is your face, and then you can insert virtual elements on it. Some apps that have been going around are like this, that is IKEA Place, that allows you to insert a virtual element, like a piece of furniture, in your environment to see how it fits, and then you can decide whether or not you want to buy it, because most of these apps, let's never forget, that are towards a commercial use. Then augmented virtuality is a little less widespread to the public. It is usually used in market investigations. So in this instance, they are trying to understand how the perception and the pleasantness of an element like food changes depending on the environment you consume in. So in this case, the real element is the food, while the virtual environment is everything that surrounds you. And this is a lot easier and cheaper than trying to place the same person in different environments one after the other and recording their reactions. And then we have pure virtual reality that is more and more convincing. This video that I brought you, it's an example of how convincing it can be. This is a snooker champion. Snooker is billiardo. And they've immersed him in a virtual environment. He tries to shoot a ball. But as he leans on the snooker table, he falls over. Because even though you see that the graphics in the game is not that convincing, it's convincing enough so that you, it's not that you are convinced that it's real, it's just that you forget that it's not real. So this brings us to the question, how does virtual reality achieve this feeling of realness. And it's not only through computer graphics, it's not only the definition of the image per se, but it's how we perceive it. So if I want to build a convincing and fooling virtual environment, how would I do it? Let's start with the notion that 80% of all the information that we perceive passes through vision, through sight. So if we are able to fool sight, that is a very good step towards a convincing virtual environment. So one of the main things that is used by virtual reality is stereopsis. We know that our perception of depth is reconstructed by the brain by fusing together the two images that are projected to each retina. And this is a process that has been on for a very long time, and images like these that are called stereograms have been around for centuries. And for a brief period of time, there was also, you could buy cameras that would allow you to have your own stereograms. And the mechanism is quite simple. There are two camera shutters, and they shoot an image at the same time from two different angles to simulate the two images that are delivered to each retina. So you can achieve depth, the illusion of depth in virtual reality by projecting a different image to each eye. So every VR visor is equipped with two LCD screens, one for each eye. And then the second thing is to be able to build an environment that moves as your head moves around. And this head tracking is achieved by using IMU, which is inertial measuring units, which are sensors that allow the field of view to change as the head moves around. Here is an example of a music video that was produced some years ago, where if you moved your head or you moved your phone, your device, then the environment would change. And this kind of tracking is called the OF tracking, so a tracking with 3 degrees of freedom. And these inertial measuring units are now equipped in any device. So every smartphone has this inertial measuring unit that is a combination of an accelerometer, a gyroscope, and a magnetometer that allows to track the position of the device on the X, Y, and Z axis. But even though if you move your head, the environment changes, if you try, let's say, to take a step, for example, the illusion breaks because the IMU is not capable of tracking your movement, the movement of your whole body in the space. So, but this is enough to have a very primitive is not the right word, but a very simple version of a virtual reality. And indeed, as nowadays all smartphones are equipped with a display big enough to project a different image to each eye, and with these IMUs, you can even build your own 3D visor at home by using cardboard. And this feels a lot straightforward and simple, and indeed all of this technology has been around for a long time. The first VR visor that was built using by uniting these two principles was this one that was so heavy that to be suspended from the ceiling, was very cumbersome, it used a lot of power, and it could only project, these are called wireframe animations, so they are geometric shapes with only the edges. But even though it was a very primitive attempt at virtual reality, it used the same two principles, stereopsis plus head tracking. But as I said, as soon as you try to take a step, the illusion is broken. So here comes the next level, that is post-tracking. Post-tracking has 6 degrees of freedom, so not only it can track you in X, Y, and Z, but also, for example, right and left, rightward and leftward motion, back and forth motion, and the result is an environment in which if the user moves, the environment changes. You can see these little drifts are the head movements, so it also tracks the head movements, and then the virtual environment adjusts to accommodate for this movement. And this is usually achieved in most VR visors with the use of base stations that are two devices that are hanged at the corners of the play area, let's call it. They flood the room with infrared light, and so in this way they are able to track the position of the visor and the controllers in a very precise way. So by uniting these two things, so the base stations with the IMUs, they are able to accommodate for these 6 degrees of freedom in the pose tracking. This is how these base stations look in real life. This method of tracking is also called lighthouse tracking. On the right, you can see an example of controllers that can be used in the virtual environment. And on the bottom is one of the last VR visors that has been commercialized, is the Oculus Quest. And its peculiarity is in the fact that it doesn't even need the base stations anymore. So they managed to have IMUs trackers so precise that they are enough to track the user in the environment. So this also means that they are more they are more user friendly, and they're a lot easier to use. And but then if we can track your movements in the virtual environment, then the real limitation is not the virtual environment per se, which can be built to be endless and infinite. It's your real environment, because if I have only a certain space to move in, then my exploration of the virtual environment is limited. So there have been companies that have started building this kind of treadmills that allow to give the illusion of moving around in the virtual environment while staying still. And so the user is on this kind, it's not a treadmill because basically it's a fixed surface and the user just slides on it, but it gives the illusion of walking in the virtual environment. And then with the visor, with the controller that in this case is shaped like a gun, then you can have a very immersive and very convincing video games. And another, with modern technologies come modern problems. And one phenomenon that has been discovered to be associated with the use of virtual reality is cyber sickness. That is literally the sickness induced by the use of virtual reality. And this happens when basically there is a mismatch between what your eyes see in the virtual environment and what your vestibular system, so the system that tracks the position of your body in the space, feels. So when something goes wrong, when the stereopsis is not perfect, when the pose tracking fails to perfectly accord your movement with the change in the visual field, then there is this feeling of sickness that is associated with virtual reality. And nowadays, virtual reality is so widespread that there are some possible uses are like in pain management. So by immersing patients in a virtual environment, you can take away their attention from pain. So some medical procedures are easier to perform. Then there is a specific training, like surgeon training, or the game I was showing you earlier could either be a very convincing game or a very convincing war simulation, for instance, and then the treatment of phobias, because if you have a specific phobia, like to reptiles, the most used treatment at the moment is cognitive behavioral therapy, and in particular, exposure therapy. So the patient is gradually exposed to the fear stimulus, and virtual reality can be a further step in this spectrum of exposure that goes towards managing the phobia. But our original question was, how can virtual reality be used in perception research and in my research? So I want to briefly introduce to you my research topic, which is peripersonal space. So peripersonal space is a way of defining the space around us and the space that immediately surrounds our body. So everything that is within arm's reach, everything that we can touch is in the peripersonal space. Everything that is beyond arm's reach is in the extrapersonal space. And past research has shown that there are populations of neurons in the monkey that are specifically dedicated to perceiving stimuli that are in the peripersonal space, because for interacting purposes with the environment and also defensive purposes, what is closer to us, it's more important than things that are far away. And these can be measured in humans because humans are faster at reacting to stimuli that are in the peripersonal space. How faster is faster? So the way that the peripersonal space in humans is usually measured is with this task that is an audio-tactile task. The participant is placed in a room and it has an array of speakers in front, one in the peripersonal space, one in the extrapersonal space. And by modulating the volume balance between the two, you can achieve the illusion of a sound that is approaching the participant. And at the same time, while the sound is approaching, at some point you deliver the participant with a vibration to the hand or to the arm, and you ask them to press a button when they feel the vibration. And then you measure how long it took them between the vibration and the press of the button. That is the reaction time. And you can see on the right that on the x-axis, there is the time starting from audio onset, so when the auditory stimulus was far away, and going on until while it gets closer. And as you can see, when the vibration is delivered, when the sound is far away, people are on average slower, and then as the audio stimulus approaches, they are faster in signaling the vibration. And of course, you can only get to a certain point of faster, then you can no longer improve. And this modulation of the reaction time can be described with a sigmoid function. And if you take the point of maximum slope of that sigmoid function, that is the precise border of the peripersonal space. Then, can you think about a way of doing this instead with auditory stimuli, with visual stimuli? You would need a visual stimulus that approaches the participant, and we are not really allowed to start throwing objects at participants. So here is where virtual reality comes into place. So this is a screenshot from an experiment I conducted last year at the University of Cyprus. Participants were immersed in this virtual environment. They were positioned in front of 3 avatars. They were shooting bubbles at them. And while the bubble was approaching them, at some point we delivered a vibration with the use of the controller. And the participants were instructed to signal the vibration with a button press. This is a short demo from the experiment. So you can see that here is the bubble, and at some point during this path of the bubble, a vibration was delivered, and we measure reaction times. But if the definition of peripersonal space is the space we can reach, if what we can reach changes, then the peripersonal space should change as well. And this is exactly what happens. So in an experiment in 2013, they had participants perform a training in which they had to use a tool to bring objects closer to them, from the extrapersonal space to the peripersonal space, for a very short time, like 10 minutes. And what they did was measuring with this audio-tactile detection task, how big was their peripersonal space before and after the training. And what they found is that there was a very similar modulation of the reaction times, but the dotted line is after tool use. And as you can see, after tool use, you get faster much sooner, which means that you react to a sound that would usually be in your extrapersonal space as if it was in your peripersonal space. So you have effectively remodulated participants' peripersonal space. And this has been replicated multiple times, this paradigm with participants having to bring objects closer. It also has been replicated in monkeys. And what we wanted to see was if this is the only kind of training that can trigger such a reshaping, and if this reshaping could also happen in virtual reality. So in our paradigm, we came up with 4 different kinds of training. One was the basically replication of this pulling training. Then there was the pushing training, same tool, different movement. So you had to push objects away from them. And then we started playing with some other kinds of action. In one training, participants had to use a hammer to smash the avatar with an up and down motion. And in the last one, they had to use a toy gun to shoot the monster. So again, pushing objects away without the use of a tool that is elongating your arm, but still a tool. So what we did was first measurement of the peripersonal space, the baseline condition, then we had participants perform one of the trainings, and then we measured again to see what happened. So here are the results. The curves are swapped compared to the previous graphs, but the rationale is the same. So on the X, you have increasing visual stimulus distance, and on the Y, you have reaction times. And as you can see, in all conditions, participants are faster when the visual stimulus is closer to them. And the red curve is the baseline, and then we have the various types of trainings. And the green curve on the left is the pool training. And as you can see, we managed to replicate what had already been found in the literature. So after this training, that again is very brief, only 10 minutes, there was an enlargement of the peripersonal space. The pushing training, which is very similar but has an opposite direction of motion, seemed to trigger some kind of an expansion, but this was not enough to reach statistical significance, so it was not effective. And then on the right, you can see the other two kinds of training, and again, very nice modulation of the reaction times with as a function of distance. But in this case, both the hammer and gun condition failed to trigger any effect. There seems to be a slight shrinkage, but it's very far from statistical significance, so we cannot really give any speculative interpretation of it. So what we found was that this pulling training, that is the one that has been validated multiple times in real life, was the only one that managed to induce a modulation of any kind, in this case, enlargement of the peripersonal space, while the other three trainings failed. And this is the first time that someone has managed to achieve a remodulation of the peripersonal space in virtual reality. So this study, first of all, it validates VR as a possible tool to use to study peripersonal space, because peripersonal space seems to behave the same way in the real world and in the virtual environment. It's we replicated previous findings, but we pushed the knowledge about how can the peripersonal space be modulated by seeing that all the other kinds of training that we tried were not effective. So there is something special about this pulling motion that we are not able to exactly pinpoint yet, but it's the only kind of training that has an effect. And possible uses for this peripersonal space reshaping can be, for example, to improve sports performance, because if you can induce a stable enlargement of the peripersonal space, this means that you improve your reaction times in a bigger area surrounding your body, and this can then improve sports performance. And this was the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and thank you to my supervisor, Professor Arrighi, and all the collaborators from the University of Cyprus. That is where we performed these experiments.
So thank you, Irene. Are there questions? Okay, Nicolò, can you come here?
Okay, beautiful talk. I was just wondering if, neurologically, you know why? So it's different areas of the brain that are involved when you go from personal space to far away. Is that so? What happens?
So basically, what they found in the monkey is that there is, in the parietal lobe, populations of neurons that only respond to stimuli that are closer to the body. So it seems that there are populations dedicated preferentially to the processing of stimuli that are in the peripersonal space. And these neurons have a very specific field of activation. And the beautiful thing is that when they tried to do this tool training in the monkeys, they saw that the receptive field of the neurons would change as if as the training was progressing. So basically, the neurons were reshaping their receptive field as a function of where you could reach with the tool. So if the tool elongates your reach of X, then there is a corresponding enlargement in the peripersonal space, and this is what happens. So it's integrated in the receptive field.
And the fact that one is faster than the other, where does it come from?
I think that the fact that that this has to do, because there are some theories about how the peripersonal space developed that are focused on the defensive function of the peripersonal space. And so the theory is that by having a preferential path of analysis of the stimuli that are closer to you, and by being faster, it also means that if you need to defend yourself, you're faster in reacting. And this is also supported by the fact that in monkeys, if you stimulate the peripersonal neurons, they start to have defensive-like behaviors. So they kind of put their paws up. So it seems like it's not clear yet, but it seems like it's the evolutionary result of a defensive mechanism.
Thank you.
For the last talk, we have Lorenzo Buffoni. Lorenzo is a researcher here at the University of Florence in the Department of Physics. His research focuses on the application of machine learning algorithms to physics and on quantum computing, and application of methods of theoretical physics to neural networks and learning theory. So, Lorenzo Buffoni, artificial intelligence and computer graphics.
Thank you so much. The idea of today's talk is to give you a bit of introduction to artificial intelligence, avoid going into much detail about mathematics, since the audience is pretty diverse. We are not all physicists as we are used to in these kind of meetings. But to highlight at the end some application in computer graphic, computer vision mostly, and some applications also like to virtual reality and other things that we have discussed today, just to give a sense of how these kind of technologies can help shape the future of these kind of seminal experiments that were started by Lippmann and all these people a long time ago. So a little bit of introduction to terminology, just to make things clear. So you probably, when you hear about machine learning, deep learning, artificial intelligence in the popular summaries in the papers, etc., you find these three terms: artificial intelligence, machine learning, and deep learning, used basically interchangeably, one with another. They are, okay, to a certain level, but I think it's important to make some distinctions. So artificial intelligence is the very general and broad concept that originated in the 50s with sci-fi books and movies about sentient machines, okay, generally. So to create an algorithm, a machine, or whatever object, and making it interact with us, humans, in a human-like way, okay? So that it can process complex input, it can reason, etc., etc. So this is the main goal of artificial intelligence, and this is the very broad scope on which we move, inside of which we move. Then we have what are called machine learning algorithms, which are a subset of this idea of artificial intelligence. So they are a set of algorithms that basically can make sense of huge amount of data, okay? And inside this machine learning space of algorithm, there is a family of algorithms which are neural network, which is what we refer usually when we talk about deep learning. Okay, so we make sense of large amounts of data using this neural network, and I will arrive to what a neural network is in a second. Using neural network, and we use this neural network to interact with the external world. And I will make example mostly on images, of course, but this can be done with text, with whatever other form of input you can think about. And interact with humans in a meaningful manner, in a non-trivial manner, as opposed to what we usually do with computers, that we program them to execute one specific function in a deterministic way, and we will see that this is not always the case with deep learning and all these families of algorithms, okay? So today we will talk about deep learning specifically. So I will, and this is not by accident, is because all the nice and cool applications that I will showcase you, but that you find also in the literature, are mostly based on neural networks and that small subset of the field of artificial intelligence. Okay. So let's start by taking a step back and looking a little bit at the neuroscience to understand what a neural network, an artificial neural network, is with respect to a real neural network, what we have in the brain, okay? And to understand the points, the similarities, and the differences, because I think it's crucial on making sense of what we are doing here, because we are not like building a human in a PC. It's kind of different, as you will see in a moment, okay? So, as you probably all know, the brain is made up of neurons. They are the cellular unit of the brain, okay? And neurons somehow receive, elaborate, and transmit signals in the form of electric pulses, okay? And these neurons talk with each other by means of synapses, okay? So connections between different neurons that carry electrical signals, okay? And these electrical signals are taken by each neuron, elaborated at a certain level, and then sent back to the other communicating neurons, okay? So this makes our brain basically a huge network, okay? So roughly 86 billions of neurons that communicate with each other through these electrical signals, okay? And all these neurons, they are not all of the same types, but they are roughly 10,000 different types, specialized in different types of operations. And each one of these 86 billions of neurons have potentially thousands of connections with other neurons. So the number of connections is really big, because if you it's 86 billions times 1,000. So it's a lot. Okay. So what is the operation that the neuron does to exchange information? Well, basically, we said there is the neuron, there are these connections with its neighbors, okay, somehow. And the neuron, what it does is that takes the signal from its neighboring neurons, and if this signal is above a certain threshold, what we call this threshold mechanism of neuron, the neuron fires its signal, okay, so it fires an electric pulse that travels to the cascades to the neighboring neurons, okay, downstream of itself, okay? And this mechanism of these electrical pulses that gets integrated, thresholded, okay, somehow, so they go above a certain threshold, the neuron activates. They do not go above the threshold, the neuron do not activate. Somehow they give rise to these complex dynamics, okay? So these electrical pulses that we can measure using, I don't know, MRI, whatever technology we want. These electrical pulses that travels in this very complex network, okay? And they give rise to all the functions that we need to be humans, okay? From living, coordinating organs, breathing, the heart pumping, to the more sophisticated one, like thoughts, like abstraction, etc., etc. Okay? So just to visualize what I'm saying, these are below there. You can see an image, actually images taken from the brain of the zebrafish, which is a fish that in its larvae form is completely transparent. This is an experiment done here in Florence. Which is completely transparent, and you can basically see inside its brain using lasers, okay? And you can see how these neurons activates in groups, sometimes alone, sometimes in group. There are these mechanisms of spontaneous synchronization that occur, like often in complex networks. There are all these complex dynamics of the signal traveling around with groups of neuron firing, then going back to normal, etc., etc. Okay, so it's a very complex object. We do not still fully understand like its behavior, its capabilities, and its inner working, but we do know like somehow this process of neuron exchanging information, integrating the signal and sending back if it goes above a certain threshold. And we know that there are lots of different neurons with lots of different functionality, and this very complex network behaves in a dynamical manner in non-trivial ways. Okay, just to stay at a very high level. So given this biological background, okay, let's now see what we talk about when we talk about an artificial neural network, about what we call a deep learning algorithm, okay? So we talk about a network, of course, in which, so the biological network is the one on the left with the neurons and the synapses. Our artificial neural network is the one on the right, in which the dots, the colored dots, are our artificial neurons, and that black connections are our synapses, okay, somehow. So what is a neural network? It's basically a mathematical function, okay, if you want. And a neural network is an object that can approximate complex objective functions, so complex mathematical function. And it takes inspiration from the brain in the sense that each neuron communicates with neighboring neurons via these synapses that have a certain weight, okay? And I will explain mathematically in a moment what having a weight means in that context. And then the neuron that receives all the connection has a threshold mechanism that is referred to as G here, which is a nonlinear function that implements this mechanism. So each neuron has a simple mathematical function that basically says, okay, if the signal that I'm getting from the neighboring neuron is above a certain threshold, I fire my signal to the other layer, otherwise I don't, okay? So the target of our training, so because this neural network have to be trained to do something, the targets of our training are these synaptic weights that make neurons interact with each other, and we will see in a moment what it means to train a network, okay? I want to take a moment to highlight the first dissimilarity between the artificial neural network and the real neural network that we have inside our skull, which is this kind of fixed structures of layers that talk to each other. So in the artificial neural network, you have a layer of neuron that talks with another layer of neurons that talks to another layer of neurons in a very structured and fixed way, while in the artificial neural network, you have all these very complicated and sparse connections which are not present in an artificial neural network, okay? And the brain also has the capability of rewiring itself at multiple levels. The artificial neural network doesn't. You can change these synaptic weights as you train it, but you cannot change the overall structure of the network. So this layer structure is kind of fixed, and that's it. You are stuck with it, and this is due to some mathematical constraints, okay, that I won't go into. So what does it mean to train a neural network? So let's suppose that we want to train a neural network to distinguish between cats and dogs, okay? So we want to train what is called a classifier. So what we do is that we make the network see several images of cats and dogs, and I will arrive in a moment of what does it mean to make a neural network see an image, okay? The signal from this image is passed through the synaptic weights to the neurons in subsequent layers, and at the end, if the network believes that that image is a dog, it will fire up the neuron corresponding to dog, otherwise it will fire up the neuron corresponding to cat. Then, since you know which one is a cat and which one is a dog, you can, if the network does a mistake, you can implement a mechanism of error correction, and you say, okay, now if you pick the bottom right cat, if I make the network see that cat, and the network predicts that it's a dog, I can go back and say to the network, okay, now you have to change your synaptic weights in such a way that the next time you will correctly predict that it's a cat. You repeat this process a lot of times, so you make the network see a lot of images for a lot of times. You correct each time that it does a mistake, and eventually you will end up with the correct synaptic weights that make the network classify a dog with a dog and a cat as a cat, okay? So that when you send a new image of another dog, okay, that the network has never seen before, it will activate the correct neuron pathways, if you want, so the correct synaptic weights, such that at the end of the network, the neuron that corresponds to that object being a dog will fire up, okay, and you will have your classification correct. Let's get mathematical for just one slide, I promise. So we will have this, generally speaking, okay, going a step back from the example of images. What do we have is a data set, so a set of pairs, input, output, okay, that we want to establish some correlation upon at some level. And we need a lot of them, okay, a lot in the order of like tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands, million of images or whatever you need, okay, so we need a lot of data. And the x's are the images, in this case, the y's are the corresponding what we call the label or the target. Just to give you an example, if we want to do handwritten digit recognition, our images will be handwritten digits, okay? And the corresponding label, so the X would be this image, and the Y would be the corresponding ground truth. So the first is a 5, the second is a 1, the other one is a none, etc., etc. So what we do is that we make the network see the image. And what we mean when we say that we make the network see the image, we say that each image can be represented as a matrix of values in, I don't know, in this case, in grayscale, 8 bits, so between 0 and 255, okay? And we can input each one of these numbers into the neurons of the first layer, okay? And then we make the network process the information at subsequent layers, okay? So we input the raw numbers that constitute the pixels of the image in the first layer, and then we make the network do its processing. And at the end, on the output layer, we will have 10 layers from 0 to 9, corresponding to the 10 digits that we want to classify, okay? And if, in this case, the neuron number 5 fires up, we know that the network believed that we are looking at the digit number 5, okay? Then this prediction gets confronted with the ground truth into what we call a loss function, and this loss function, which tells you how many errors you are making, basically, can be optimized using usually gradient descent, but whatever technique you want, okay? So can be optimized mathematically using your algorithm of choice, okay? And also, like, I've put this very simple loss function, but there are whole families of loss functions that you can define based on the problem that you're interested to solve, but I don't want to be too general here. Okay, so this data set is called MNIST. For reference, is a very famous benchmark data set in machine learning. So again, what you do, you take the image, and as you can see in that small video above, the information is processed by this synaptic weight, which in mathematical terms is a linear transformation, so it's a vector matrix multiplication, and then you have a nonlinear filter, so a nonlinear function, which is the threshold mechanism that we mutuate from biology, these nonlinearities. And then, as you can see, you pass the information, some neurons fire up, some other don't, and then at the end, you are left with your correct, hopefully, answer, okay? So a neural network is just a collection of these linear, nonlinear transformation, vector matrix multiplications, and nonlinear functions, okay? A key thing that we do is that usually we train using a huge, potentially, reservoir of data, okay, in this case, images. But what we want to know at the end of the training is that this network that we have trained has really learned something, or if it's just like, as we do with student, we want to know that the student understood the task and it didn't memorize the book by heart without understanding the concepts, right? So what do? We take some data and we hide them from the network, and we call that test set. And we use that test set at the end of the training to gauge the capability of the network to generalize to data that it has never seen before, okay? So there are these subset of data that you have never seen. Are you still able to understand, to properly reconstruct like what we want from this data, or are you a simple deterministic algorithm that has memorized to go from A to B without a real understanding, okay, of what's going on? Usually they manage, if you do things correctly, to generalize, okay? And just to give some consideration about this, like very brief overview of machine learning from this perspective, because before I show you a couple of applications. So first, the number of parameters that we train is huge, okay? Potentially, like for a small network is tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, to the very state-of-the-art, which is ChatGPT-like models, which are on the order now of trillions of parameters, okay? So a lot. There is this biological reference that I talked to you about, but this is very evocative. So in the artificial neural network, we have this fixed structure with just one type of neuron. And the only thing that we take inspired from biology is this kind of these synaptic connections, if you want, as this and this threshold mechanism. The other thing is that these neural networks are potentially extremely good at handling one task at a time, but they fail at learning multiple things. So once you have learned, you are done. You cannot relearn something new on top of what you already know. You will forget anything basically instantly. And artificial neural networks are kind of a black box, okay? It's kind of hard to gauge. There are some techniques, but it's kind of hard to precisely know when they are gonna fail and why they are gonna fail, okay? And which is a problem for some application, not all of them, okay? So skipping through it, why now? Because we have a lot of power, mostly in the form of graphical processing unit, which are extremely good for handling the calculation, the matrix vector multiplications that we need for machine learning, and because we have a lot of data, but you know that. Applications. So moving on to the simple idea of doing handwritten digit recognition that I showed you, you can expand this a little bit and you can do object detection in general. So as before we were recognizing handwritten digit, now you can recognize different elements in an environment. And as you can see here, you can recognize cars from street signs to persons, okay, all these things. And this is the basis for a lot of applications, mostly self-driving cars, but not only. You can do like tracking of persons in a virtual environment and things like that, okay, with this kind of techniques. Another interesting topic, especially for like some of the things that we have talked about today, is on conservation and restoration. For example, this is an example from a paper of last year on Nature, which did like completion on these Greek tablets which had missing parts for problems in conservation. Like you find these tablets, this inscription that has some holes, and usually the historians try to make up somehow to predict which are the missing words, right? And you can ask, you can train a neural network to do this for you, and it does with like quite a remarkable accuracy, especially when working alongside an historian, okay, that can vet somehow the results of the neural network. So this is an application, but we have also here in Florence at Labec, we have a lot of people that use neural network to do conservation, restoration, all this kind of stuff. Another example, which is particularly relevant for this Lippmann thing that we are here today, is the example of colorization. So you can make a neural network learn how an image in black and white would look with colors. Of course, this is by no means physically accurate. The network is making up colors which are realistic given the context and the grayscales that it sees, but you can see it's pretty convincing. Okay, it does a good job. Other and this can be done also on videos, of course, because they're just a collection of images, so it's not really a surprise. Another thing that it can do, still regard like old photos, documents, and stuff like that, but also this is a technique which is used already in high-end graphics cards for gaming, is this technique of super sampling or super resolution, where you take a very like grainy image or video and you super resolve, so you scale up the resolution with a neural network. Okay, so in this case, the input-output pairs that we are training the neural network on are the low resolution version and the high resolution version of the video. But I want you to like keep in mind that this like input-output relation is the same that we have seen in the simple example of the handwritten digit. Okay, it just changes what is the input and what is the output, but the mechanism is exactly the same. Okay, and you can see it does an impressive job in super resolving, such that in high-end NVIDIA graphics card, if you are into gaming, okay, you will find this option which is called DLSS, which stands for Deep Learning Super Sample, which basically makes your GPU render the game at half of the resolution or 1/4 of the resolution, so it's faster, and then it upsamples it using these kind of techniques, which works really well. Another example, which is kind of connected to like virtual reality and things like that, is the possibility of like generating virtual characters. So all these faces that you see here are generated by a neural network. Okay, none of these humans is real, and they all look very convincing, like very realistic people. And on the video, you can see this application that by just doing a very like childish painting of what you want to see on the left, it renders a kind of realistic image on the right that can be created to generate like virtual environments, to generate art. You might have seen this in the context of art generation and things like that. I believe that I am done. Yeah. So this was just to tell you, like, give you a very brief overview of some examples that touch on the things that we have discussed today. But of course, these techniques are very general. In every case where you have a lot of data and you want to establish some kind of input-output relation, which is non-trivial, you can use a neural network for it, and it hopefully will work. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorenzo. I think if you have some fast questions, otherwise we can ask more complicated questions at lunch, because we have the catering.
Because we are hungry.
Yeah, we are hungry. And let me thank again Massimo, which is not here, and Giovanna, who helped us with the organization of everything, and all the speakers, and you that you are here. I hope you enjoy